These continual legislative developments, plus the fragmented nature of device rules on the global level, mean that clients and companies continually need to assess and adapt their regulatory compliance strategies, and that can be time-consuming and resource-heavy.
Hello. Welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. We're the leading independent, nonpartisan podcast on FDA. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. I'm very excited about this episode. It's another installment in one of our signature multi-episode series that we produced in collaborations with law firms or with other organizations. Today's episode is the second in a four-part series that we're doing with one of the truly well-known and renowned global food and drug law firms, Covington. This is a four-part series. It's called Medical Device Regulation. We're focused on medical devices, called Medical Device Regulation, Compliance and Policy. We're going to focus on the cutting-edge issues that face medical device companies and FDA stakeholders. We're going to do an international scope. This will be particularly international in nature. Our first episode had Amy Leeser and Scott Danzis from Covington and Susan Van Meter, who is president of the American Clinical Lab Association. They discussed diagnostics regulation. Their podcast is available on our website, fdawatch.net. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing, as I said, on global medical device regulatory issues, particularly in China and in Europe. We have just the right guests to cover that, so let's meet them right now. Sarah Cowlishaw is a partner in Covington's European Food, Drug, and Devices practice. She's co-chair of the firm's Digital Health Initiative. She advises a broad range of clients on European regulatory and compliance matters with a particular focus on medical devices and diagnostics and digital health. Sarah joined Covington in 2009 and has spent her entire legal career at Covington. Welcome to FDA Watch, Sarah.
Thanks, Wayne. Good to be here.
John Balzano is a partner in Covington's Food, Drug, and Device Group. He focuses on life sciences regulatory issues in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly China. He covers the entire product life cycle from development through to post-market enforcement. Welcome to FDA Watch, John. Good to see you.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Julia Post is of Counsel in Covington's Food, Drug, and Device practice. Her regulatory advising practice spans both the U.S. and China and the Asia-Pacific region. She advises clients in the medical devices area and other life sciences areas on regulatory and compliance matters, with a particular focus on clinical trials and data and specimen transfer and access considerations. Welcome to FDA Watch, Julia.
Thanks, Wayne. Great to be with you today.
So let me start out today with a broad question. What is the most important global issue that your clients are concerned about right now in the regulatory area? Sarah, I want to start out with you and then ask John and Julia to weigh in. So again, what is the most important global issue that your clients are concerned about right now? Sarah?
Sure. Thanks, Wayne. I think one of the biggest challenges, at least from a European perspective, is the ever-changing regulatory landscape and the lack of global harmonization. This can make it very hard for companies to effectively plan their global regulatory strategies. We're seeing an increasing interplay of rules and constant flux of existing legislation and proposals. I think traditionally, medical device companies existed in a relatively discrete regulatory environment, but there are now numerous overlapping rules and frameworks that medtech clients need to be aware of and keep pace with, including evolving frameworks for artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and health data. These continual legislative developments, plus the fragmented nature of device rules on the global level, mean that clients and companies continually need to assess and adapt their regulatory compliance strategies, and that can be time-consuming and resource-heavy.
We hear that a lot, in the U.S., among the states and the federal government, of course. there are sometimes disparities, and on the international basis, there are even greater disparities. So, that seems to be a universal problem, not just in medical devices. John, the most important global issue that your clients are facing?
Sure. So I very much echo what Sarah said in terms of it being, sort of harmonization of potentially, significantly different requirements across countries and including across regions. I think a lot of our clients early on, maybe 5-10 years ago, they were basically, thinking of applying the same requirements and standards in the APAC region as they were using for their US or EU-based operations. And given the growth of medical device regulation, particularly in China over the last 25 years, but really like intensely since 2014. That approach, I think there has been a gradual realization is no longer really feasible, right? So you now have very sort of intense and specific, product level, system level requirements for medical devices in China. You'd already had them for Japan for some time, and now we're watching them emerge sort of more across the different countries in Southeast Asia. So I think that presents quite a challenge, right? We can't just we have to relook at our SOPs, we have to look at our approach to registration and marketing, and we have to now sort of apply the specific local requirements and integrate them into our overall global approach, which is challenging when you have potential design differences or requirements for design across regions. You often design a device for the world and not specifically with respect to one country. So I think that's the main challenge we see.
Julia, same question.
Yeah, I mean, to echo some of the things that both Sarah and John are mentioning, when you're thinking about setting up a global development program, one of the biggest challenges right now is understanding and complying with restrictions on transfers of data and materials throughout the world, in particular getting data or biospecimens into China and out of China, which John can address in detail. And this really has been a focus for the life sciences industry lately, and medical device companies are no exception, getting used to these new sort of biosecurity type laws and regimes where their currency, essentially, like the data and the biospecimens they work with and generate as part of their R&D efforts, now need to be looked at and evaluated from this sort of national security, biosecurity lens to ensure they're in compliance. And so, these developments, which I think we'll talk a bit more about later, they're leading companies to take a look at their global portfolios and R&D programs and consider whether adjustments are needed for kind of this new world or to mitigate risk. So as part of this kind of like lack of harmonization, there's this overlay of how you stand up a compliant program that meets your business needs with these new considerations in mind.
So 2 more follow-up questions. Let me start out with Sarah. Are things getting worse, or is there a recognition of the lack of harmonization problem and people are working to address it? Sarah, let me start with you and then go to John and Julia.
I think in the medical device space particularly, things not necessarily getting worse, but they're not getting any better. I think the medical device space still has very distinct pathways in different markets that companies need to navigate when they're thinking about their global strategy. And even within those particular markets or regions, the rules there are in constant flux. And we'll go on to talk about the EU shortly and some of the changes that have been happening there. But when you have those distinct frameworks in various markets that you're then trying to operationalize, I think it's a very difficult environment to be operating in.
John, Julia?
I think things are, I think it really depends on the potentially the product area in some respects as to whether they're getting worse or better. I think in certain product areas in China, maybe stakeholders have had a very productive dialogue and grappled with some of the differences, and that's worked out or is working out. But I think that there's still quite a bit of difference, and it's a very varied area in the medical device space with multiple different sub areas. So I think there's still a lot of challenges.
Julia, anything to add?
I'll just add quickly. I mean, I think from the sort of biosecurity, national security standpoint that I was mentioning before, this seems to be kind of a new age for the medical device space and life sciences space to be grappling with. So I think we're kind of at the cusp, actually, of this sort of filtering out and becoming a little less harmonized. I mean, these are individual national security interests at play, and we see efforts in the U.S. this happening at both the federal and state level with an eye toward China and other countries of concern. So I don't think this is trending in a direction where it's data can flow as easily as it could before. This is a new age.
Yes, it's clear that harmonization is a major international issue. I want to turn specifically to the regulation of medical devices in Europe and China, starting out with Sarah. Sarah, could you provide a brief overview of the medical device framework in Europe and summarize some of the recent developments that we should all be aware of? And then I'm going to turn to John and ask the same question about China.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the EU side, this just goes to show some of the kind of constant changes that we were alluding to at the beginning. So in the EU, the medical device framework has been in what feels like constant change for the last several years. It started with the overhaul of the prior medical device legislation back in 2021 and 2022, with the introduction of the EU medical devices regulation, so the MDR, and the in vitro diagnostic medical devices regulation, the IVDR. These pieces of legislation replaced the prior EU medical device framework with the aim of introducing more rigorous conformity assessment processes and clinical data requirements for devices that have been placed on the European market. The introduction of the new rules, however, were marred with lots of different challenges. In the EU, unlike, for example, in the US, there's no government pre-market review of medical devices and diagnostics. Instead, manufacturers must self-certify that their devices comply with the rules. And they do this through the use of notified bodies, which are independent private entities that conduct conformity assessment for higher risk devices, or for lower risk devices, they can self-certify themselves for compliance with the rules. But when the new rules, the MDR and IVDR, took effect, notified bodies that are involved in certain assessments were required to be designated under the new rules to actually perform those assessments. And that led to huge bottlenecks in the ability of these notified bodies to do the conformity assessments, which meant that new products were struggling to get to market and old products were struggling to comply with the new framework, which meant that ultimately the European Commission had to extend transitional periods on multiple occasions to give companies more time to comply with those requirements. On top of that, notified bodies have historically been not very transparent, so companies are not clear on the timelines for review or the cost for review. And there are also lots of broader teething problems at the member state level around inconsistent implementation of the new MDR and IVDR. So that led to major concerns about the competitiveness and effectiveness of the EU medical device framework. And against that backdrop, and recognizing some of those concerns and the industry lobbying that's been going on for a number of years, in December last year, so relatively recently, the European Commission published proposals to simplify the existing EU medical device framework and to try and make the rules easier, faster, and more effective, really with the aim of promoting competitiveness and innovation and patient safety. So those proposals, which, as I say, came out in December, they are at this stage just proposals. So it's very early stage in the legislative process, but it's a significant stage. The Commission has published the proposals, which will now go for comment and review by the European Parliament and the Council before hopefully being adopted, but unlikely to be before 2027 at the earliest. They're open for public comments, so people that are manufacturing or placing devices on the market in Europe can make comments until March on those proposals. But they really could introduce significant changes for medical device manufacturers, as well as diagnostic companies and the biopharma industry more broadly that are involved with medical devices and IVDs in Europe.
Are they moving more toward a US type system?
So they're not moving more towards a US type system. The proposals are not going to change the fundamental way that medical devices are assessed in Europe. So it will still be a combination of self-assessment by manufacturers and involvement of notified bodies for higher risk devices. But what they're going to do is take steps to reduce compliance burdens. So some of the big proposals are around introducing uniform rules for notified body assessments. So making sure there is greater transparency around how long a process will take, how much it will cost, giving the notified bodies statutory review times, which is obviously common in the pharmaceutical sector in Europe, and also I think in the US sector with medical device approvals. So that will allow companies to have more certainty of how the process will go. But they're also going to introduce new rules to incentivize the development of orphan devices and also breakthrough devices that are highly innovative. So again, unlike the pharmaceutical sector, which has incentives to develop products for orphan designations or provides exclusivity periods for innovative products, the European device framework doesn't have that. So the rules are hoping to address some of that in their proposals.
Yeah, and with among your clients, how serious is the disparity between European and U.S. regulation of medical devices? They've been dealing with that for some time, and how do they deal with that?
I think historically, Europe has always been perceived to be the easier route to market than the US. So before the introduction of the MDR and the IVDR, getting a CE mark was seen to be, your first strategy. You would get a CE mark, you would launch in Europe, you would gather clinical data, and then you would go through the FDA process. Because of all of the change the MDR and IVDR introduced, and some of the challenges that came with, what we have seen anecdotally is that many companies are changing their strategy to go to the US first, with Europe to follow. And I think the reasons for that are often that the FDA is now perceived to be better able to give pre-scientific advice, to have pre-submission meetings, to give you a clearer path, along with those timelines and decision-making points that are really critical when you're trying to plan a regulatory strategy. So I think some of these proposals, particularly around the processes for notified bodies, are trying to emulate some of that to make it clearer for companies as they go through these steps.
Right, and clearly an evolving situation. John, I want to turn to you, go to the other side of the world, to China. What is the framework in China, just generally, overview, but any recent developments that should be on our radar?
Like with Europe, we've been on a sort of roller coaster of change and evolution in China as well. China's medical device regulatory framework looks a lot like the U.S. in certain respects. There's 3 classes of device. You receive some form of a pre-market approval, before you put a device on the market. There is as of sort of recently, there's a system of, investigational applications for clinical trials for certain subset of class 3, devices. China, there's sort of 2 things to really say. I mean, number one is, China has been in a process of kind of, evolving its framework legislation. And I'll just call it legislation. For now, it's a regulation. And they change the framework regulation every, 5 to 7 years or something like that. Give or take, and some revisions have taken longer than others. And when they do those evolutions, they incorporate, when they do those changes, they incorporate sort of things that have been bubbling up. They add provisions on, laboratory developed tests. They reduce restrictions on, distribution of certain devices. They evolve their framework for clinical evaluation of devices and the way in which we're going to look at sort of whether clinical trial or other type of clinical evaluation is required. So they make changes like that, and it's all been, with an eye towards efficiency and sort of, creating sort of more, certainty and more detail surrounding the roles of different, stakeholders, the marketing authorization holders, the marketing authorization holders, the distributors, and the manufacturers, as well as the user entities. The other thing that's been happening is there's always been sort of this body of standards that apply to devices, device products, specific types of products, and then also specific types of testing and specific types of quality system requirements. And that is like several thousand of those standards, and they have been sort of in a cycle of reorganizing, revising, and making those standards clearer and updating them so that they're sort of hopefully a bit more internationally harmonized, although that doesn't always end up being the case. And that evolution really has I think presented challenges, and that's where we see the harmonization angle coming in. Are we going to be able to? If this is based on an ISO standard that is a couple of years old, are we going to be able to run the same tests? Are we going to be able to do the same thing? And I'll get to this, but I mean, really, sort of what has brought this to a head is the level of enforcement that has also come with some of these changes. So I think we're seeing sort of this evolution of legislation and standards, and that is keeping stakeholders kind of having to evolve their approach to China. It's absolutely creating new opportunities. It's absolutely creating more clarity and sort of better, more efficient processes for bringing devices to the market in some respects, but in other respects, it's making changes that may impact design, it may impact sort of quality systems, and not all of those may always be welcome changes.
Yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit, switch over to Julia. Julia, before you mentioned the global issues of international access to and the transfer of data and biospecimens. Can you share an overview of what's going on in that area? That's a huge area around the globe, and of course a lot of technology areas.
Yeah, you're right. It is. It's a big issue, and there have been a lot of developments that are originating on the U.S. side, but have implications for development programs worldwide. And so the biggest development in this space is what's known as the Data Security Program, or DSP, which was established pursuant to an executive order that President Biden issued in February of 2024. And really what the DSP is, which is being implemented by the U.S. Department of Justice, is at its core a national security regulation that seeks to either prohibit or restrict access to sensitive personal data on U.S. persons by countries of concern or covered persons. And these are all terms of art within this new regime. The DSP went into effect last April in 2025. There was a period of kind of enforcement discretion that was implemented by DOJ for the first few months, but and some of the compliance aspects of it went into effect just last fall in October. But the regime is fully in effect, and it's a really different way to look at how data is used, both internally within a company, but then also how it moves hands with your collaborative partners. So, as I mentioned, it really is intended to either prohibit or restrict access to this sensitive personal data. And it does this, in a few different ways. One is, it has to be access that's being provided through a commercial transaction, and there are a few different types. One of the types is a data brokerage transaction, which is defined very broadly under the rule, and that can reach your co-development agreements or arrangements with partners in countries of concern, which includes China, or even in just non-U.S. foreign jurisdictions as well. It also reaches commercial transactions that are vendor, employment, or investment agreements. In terms of the type of data, the way the DSP approaches this is there's kind of two big tranches. One is U.S. government-related data, and any amount of that is considered to be sufficient to create these national security risks. So if a U.S. person is making any amount of government-related data available to an entity in a country of concern, to a person, a non-U.S. person who resides in the country of concern, that gets swept into these prohibitions and restrictions. What a lot of our clients are focused on is less the government-related data and this other bucket of data, the sensitive personal data about U.S. persons. There are 6 different types, but within that is human omic data and human genomic data as a subset, personal health data, and biospecimens from which that human omic data could be derived. And the thresholds for these sensitive personal data, it varies according to the national security risk DOJ ascribes to the bucket of data. So for human genomic data about US persons, the threshold is just 100 US persons over the course of a year. For personal health data, that jumps to 10,000 US persons. But again, when we're talking about companies that are, this is kind of like the lifeblood of the company and how they develop their products, you can reach these thresholds pretty quickly. So this is really kind of right in the wheelhouse for issues they'll need to be thinking about in terms of how data is accessed internally within the company, shared across affiliates or subsidiaries that may be based in a country of concern. And it matters too for kind of your business development efforts with partners that are outside the U.S. And I mentioned that one of the countries of concern is China. This tends to be the big focus because of how much our clients have established kind of global development efforts with a base or at least a partner based in China as part of those efforts. And so it requires very careful consideration about how you're working with those partners or with your colleagues, honestly, in those spaces. There are other countries of concern, just to be clear. It's not just China. Under the rule, the DSP, it includes Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. But China, which includes Hong Kong and Macau in this case, tends to be a major focus. And so what this program does is forces companies to, as DOJ refers to it, know their data. You really have to know who has access to data and for what reasons, and to figure out, one, whether it's within scope of the DSP or whether it might fall within an exemption under DSP. And there are some that are relevant to the life sciences space, but they're pretty nuanced, and whether they apply will depend on the reason for the data access and who is accessing the data. So as I mentioned, this comes up in the medical device space. We've seen it a lot in terms of like companion diagnostic development, where if you are working with a partner in a country of concern and that partner is not necessarily going to be front and center on your regulatory filings, is playing more of a behind the scenes role, your ability to rely on some of these exemptions in the rule may be very limited. And then you have very tight restrictions on the amount of data that could be transferred without tripping the prohibitions under the rule. And one of the prohibited spaces includes these data brokerage sort of scenarios with a covered person in a country of concern. And so that can create a lot of challenges business-wise.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. I want to turn to digital health and AI. We can't have a discussion about medical devices these days or about anything involving FDA without talking about AI, of course. So we'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking to Sarah Cowlishaw, John Balzano, Julia Post from Covington. We're talking medical devices on a global basis. So I want to turn to digital health and AI. Sarah, on the European side, what developments have there been in the digital health space? Talk us through what's going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can link some of these back to the recent commission proposals that I mentioned earlier as well. But there's quite a lot of going on the digital health and AI side, but I think I'll just talk about two of them. So first, let's talk about the proposed changes to the rules on medical device software under the EU MDR. And then let's also think about some of the rules that have been happening alongside with the introduction of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. So on the medical device software proposals, under EU rules, medical devices are classified into four categories: Class 1, Class 2A, Class 2B, and Class 3, with Class 1 being the lowest risk and Class 3 being the highest. Class 1 devices can be self-certified by the manufacturer, but every other category of device requires involvement of a notified body. Under the existing medical device framework, so prior to the proposals that have just been announced by the Commission, for standalone software medical devices, the majority of these products fall within Class 2A, and that means that notified bodies are required to be involved in the conformity assessment process for software as a medical device, which can delay time to market and obviously increase costs for bringing products to market. The new Commission proposals that I mentioned earlier have proposed that the classification rules be amended essentially to provide more flexibility for a broader class of software device to fall within Class 1, meaning it could be self-certified and avoid the requirement to go through notified body approval. Now, this could have a big impact on software manufacturers or medical device software manufacturers, given that since the introduction of the MDR and IVDR, it's been quite difficult and challenging for medical device software manufacturers to bring their products to market and to navigate some of the notified body issues. So if these proposals are adopted as currently proposed, then we think that would produce a reduction on compliance burden for the manufacturers of medical device software. And then the second topic that I just wanted to touch on is around the EU AI Act. So the EU has been grappling with the introduction of the EU AI Act alongside the changes to the medical device framework. And for the medtech industry, this has caused particular challenges given the potential overlap between the new AI rules and those under the existing medical device framework. So the EU AI Act is a horizontal piece of legislation that applies across different industries and different sectors. So it's not specific to life sciences, it's not specific to medical devices, but it will capture relevant products within those sectors if they satisfy the requirements. But what the EU AI Act seeks to do is introduce EU-wide harmonized rules on AI, which will regulate AI systems based on a risk-based approach, with the heaviest obligations placed on what they call high-risk AI systems. Now, for the device industry, what's important to note is that high-risk AI systems can include standalone AI medical device software products, and also medical devices that incorporate AI components, importantly, where those devices have been subject to a notified body conformity assessment. So under the device frameworks, things that fall into Class 2A or above. So the AI Act is set to introduce a number of overlapping and duplicative conformity assessment obligations for manufacturers of AI software, medical device software, or medical devices that incorporate an AI component. And those manufacturers of relevant devices will need to complete conformity assessments under both the AI Act and the MDR or IVDR, as well as compile technical documentation and maintain quality management systems under each piece of legislation. The industry has been very concerned about this, given that there's no actual regulatory gap under the medical device framework, and AI products are regulated under that framework and already have to comply with rigorous requirements. And there's also been a strong concern that notified bodies won't be appropriately qualified to perform the assessments, raising again concerns around bottlenecks that have been present in the EU system for a number of years. So that said, I mean, the Commission proposals that came out at the end of last year around the MDR have expressly recognised that the parallel application of the MDR and IVDR and the EU AI Act could lead to overlaps of requirements and stifle innovation. So it has proposed, alongside making the amendments to the MDR, to make some amendments to the EU AI Act to mean that companies that do have products that fall within scope of both sets of rules won't have to go through quite so many obligations as were originally contemplated. So again, if those proposals are adopted, that should help to reduce some of the compliance burden that manufacturers have been experiencing.
Are there major conflicts between the direction that US is taking on AI as contrasted with what's going on in Europe?
So with the FDA and AI, I think the FDA tends to be further ahead than the European Commission and the regulators when it comes to medical device software. The AI developments that we're seeing in Europe are primarily cross-sector pieces of legislation, such as the EU AI Act, and then regulators in the life sciences sector are reacting to that. But the guidance that's come out to date doesn't go into as much granularity as the FDA guidance might.
John, talk about China and AI.
Well, they're very enthusiastic about these two areas, and have had an initiative to sort of develop them for quite some time. Certainly starting with, as Sarah said, the development of guidelines and sort of a place for what they refer to as independent software, or sort of software as a medical device, and distinguishing that from software in a medical device. The first to sort of build up was the registration requirements in this area, what they were going to look for in terms of, classification, in other words, what classes it falls into, 1, 2, or 3. Most software is in 2 or 3. All software is in 2 or 3. And then how to develop it, sort of what those requirements were going to be, and then in addition, sort of building out, the unique areas just like cybersecurity and that type of testing, and making sure that the appropriate cyber risk analysis is done and given to the regulator before the device is approved. I think where China sort of needs to continue thinking is about mainly about the distribution of software as a medical device. They haven't really adapted their distribution rules to kind of create a special place for that and acknowledge the special features as much as one would hope. But they certainly are developing their manufacturing side of it. They have a special, good manufacturing practice appendix for software as a medical device, which means it's, everybody has to comply with the main body of the GMP for devices, both people manufacturing devices inside of China and outside of China. And then there are specialized appendices that govern for different types of devices, dental devices, implantable devices. So software is one of those, and we're watching that evolve too, and watching sort of the quality regime, adapt to how it, thinks about the appropriate quality system for software. So that's been very exciting. And I mean, China's market for health apps and increasingly sophisticated software has been great. It hasn't been as clear about sort of the line between what is not a device and is just basically sort of exercise software, and what is a device, and what it really needs to be requires the registration and post marketing regulation. On the AI side, also very, advanced in the sense of really developing an entire body of guidelines and standards to assist with the development of artificial intelligence medical devices, and they have approved quite a few, and thinking through special issues with classification. So I think China has has really thought about how digital health technology and artificial intelligence in the healthcare area can enhance sort of the patient experience and sort of fill in some of the gaps that exist in China, where we have, early on, 2014, 2015, it was, sort of evolving sort of view on telehealth and being able to connect, different regions of China to different doctors that might be in Shanghai or Beijing or Guangdong or other places, where there might be specialists that are important to those who are not in that place. And then we saw sort of the evolution of, that, and probably more focus on it during the pandemic, where folks could not leave their homes, and then certainly more since then on AI and the ability to kind of diagnose and assist in diagnosis, assist physicians with diagnosis. So it's been a very rapidly developing area. It's been a very, and certainly one in which there is a lot of thought applied. There are regular conferences. The Center for Medical Device Evaluation in China has a digital health initiative. So it continues to be an area of development, and I think they've thought through a lot of, issues. I will say, just to note, that this is like not just something that's for China. The Asia Pacific region generally, including in the Southeast Asian nations that are part of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, have been developing sort of a view on digital health and incorporating that to their regulations. And they have a sort of a regional software medical device directive that talks about software. So I think it's been sort of a regional development, but I think China has really gone further than those other places, for now. But there's a lot of development there. So if you go and you talk to the different companies, it's very, very exciting. And I think there's a long way to go with adapting that area of regulation, to sort of traditional medical device model.
What about the adoption of digital health by the population? I don't know, whether it's. Let me ask a question this way: are they ahead of us, us being the U.S., in terms of the adoption of digital health as a useful tool?
I don't. It's hard for me to say who's ahead and who's behind, but I mean, I think there's great enthusiasm for it. I think that there's I think folks really see the utility of it, and it's an important tool, for those who can't leave their homes, or those, or just for connecting, and reducing, potential sort of geographic disparity in the country. So I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. It's hard for me to say who's ahead and who's behind. I think, at one point, China had approved more AI, based devices than other places, but it certainly is looking for creative ways to deploy that technology. But I think it's it's definitely been an area that's growing. I don't think we've seen any sort of retrenchment or backing off of this area. So, but yeah, it continues to be a hot area.
Right. Have time for one more question. It's an open-ended question. What should medical device companies be on the lookout for over the next 12 months? You take out your crystal balls and what's going to happen in the next 12 months or so? John, I want to start with you and then turn to Sarah and then Julia. John?
I think, I think we probably need to be on the lookout for sort of the evolving, environment for enforcement in China with respect to some of the new areas of medical device regulation that they're building out. And for me, like, the area to watch is always the quality system. We went from a time where, we were going to, folks who were bringing things to China were just using sort of kind of doing it based on the standards they were deploying elsewhere, like in the US and the EU, and now we're more and more focused on the China specific standards and the differences there. But then we also have a increasingly robust regime for overseas inspections. For China, they're going abroad. They're doing post-marketing inspections. Now they're doing pre-market verification inspections on site, sometimes overseas. So I really think that we have to continue to watch how that develops, because those are very significant, undertakings, given sort of the depth and complexity of the regulations in China. So I would keep your eye on that. They just have a new GMP now. They're going to have a new medical device administration law coming down the pipeline, all with a lot of significant substantive quality content. So I would predict that we'll continue to see growth there.
On the European side, I think companies should just continue to monitor the changes that we've outlined today. So continuing to see where the proposals by the Commission land on the revisions to the MDR and IVDR. As I said at the beginning, I don't think the changes to the law will take effect until at least 2027, but companies with products in the space should be taking an active interest in those to see where they might land and how they might change the environment. And then also keep an eye on the broader landscape, so things like the AI Act, European health data space, cybersecurity developments that might impact European products. And then finally, we didn't have time to talk about the UK today, but the UK has a different framework to Europe and falls outside of the MDR and IVDR. And there are many different pieces of legislation changes that are happening on the UK side. So for companies that are trying to launch European-wide, I think there's lots of things for them to be thinking about.
Julia, final word. What do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. I mean, and I'm thinking about this from kind of a U.S.-China standpoint. I mean, this is just a really dynamic space. I think there's reason to keep an eye on developments on both sides. And on the U.S. side, at both the federal and state level, we've seen some signals from the U.S. side about careful scrutiny of data that's coming out of China, potentially including from early stage human subjects research. At the same time, China's been taking further steps to shore up good clinical practice requirements and research frameworks, including related to kind of innovative biomedical technologies like AI-assisted diagnosis and treatment, and making sure there's adherence to GCP requirements, that the research is taking place at sophisticated, advanced research institutions with well-qualified ethics committees and such. And so, I think as this moves back and forth, just need to see how the countries are kind of responding to each other to allow for these sort of global development programs to continue.
Yeah, well, we're on the cutting edge of everything here in terms of digital health, in terms of AI, in terms of international collaboration or the lack thereof. So I want to thank all three of you, Sarah, John, Julia, for educating us about what's going on in international device regulation. It is clearly rapidly evolving. We'll take a look at your predictions in the next year, in 12 months, and see where we are. But this has been a great session. I appreciate all three of you participating so actively. I want to thank our podcast creator and our executive producer, Michael Evan Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind all of you who are listening, if you want to know more about the podcast, if you want to listen to previous podcasts, we just posted one on food regulation, which also was very, very educational. Just visit our website, fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net. You can subscribe to our podcast, and by doing that, by just putting in your email address and saying submit, you will get notices whenever we post a podcast. You don't want to miss parts 3 and 4 of this series. We're doing it with Covington. The only way to guarantee that you won't is by subscribing, fdawatch.net. Our podcast is growing very quickly. We have more than 13,000 downloads. That's because so many people have signed up to be subscribers. And again, I would encourage you to do so, fdawatch.net. So, as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.